A metallic rattle tore through the aging condominium complex at dawn, piercing the usual hush that cloaked the winding corridors. It came from the outdated elevator, known to shriek and stutter at the most inconvenient times. Yet in Redwood Vista Condominiums, an enclave of retirees and longtime homeowners, the sound was all too familiar. Most residents rolled their eyes at the disturbance. After all, complaints to the Homeowners Association, HOA, had piled up for months with no real response. No one could have guessed this particular squeal of metal on metal would set events in a motion that would cost a good man his life. Gerald Morrison, a 62-year-old retired accountant and devoted grandfather, stepped out of his modest unit, balancing a small cooler bag that contained his insulin. Gerald had been living with type 2 diabetes for over 2 decades now, and he'd gotten into the habit of carrying extra medication wherever he went. He lived on the 9th floor, and while he usually opted for the stairs to keep active, his arthritic knees had been acting up, leaving him no choice but to trust the cranky old elevator. He pushed the call button, and the elevator doors slid open halfway, jolting to a standstill before completing the motion. Gerald sucked in a breath, concern lighting up his gentle blue eyes. "Come on, you can do it," he muttered under his breath, tapping the doors with a half-smile as though coaxing a stubborn pet. It was his way. Treat every malfunction with polite encouragement. Finally, with a reluctant screech, the doors gave in. Inside the small compartment, the fluorescent lighting flickered. The elevator walls were scuffed from years of grocery carts, pet carriers, and the occasional piece of furniture that got wedged in at odd angles. Gerald pressed the button for the ground floor and winced as the elevator lurched downward in a series of disjointed shutters. "Not today," he whispered, feeling his heart rate jump. He often carried glucose tablets too, but the last thing he wanted was for anxiety to trigger a blood sugar drop. The Redwood Vista Condominiums had once been a sought-after address in the late 1980s. Over the years, time's relentless march had left the place with leaky roofs and creaky elevators. Residents had banded together to form an HOA that would, in theory, manage upkeep. But politics and personal agendas soon overshadowed practicality. The board members, a group of 5 that seldom agreed on anything, poured their energies into cosmetic projects like flower beds and fresh paint for the lobby walls. The pressing matter of the unreliable elevator was shelved meeting after meeting due to budget constraints. That morning, Gerald was heading to his weekly breakfast club, a local diner where retirees from the condo complex convened over waffles and coffee, catching up on each other's lives, ailments, grandkids, and old stories. A rumor had been circulating among them. The elevator had recently stalled between floors 3 and 4, trapping an elderly resident for nearly 40 minutes. She had eventually been rescued, but not before a panic attack took her breath away. The diner group unanimously agreed that something needed to be done. Still, official HOA documentation offered little hope. The funds allegedly weren't there to fix major mechanical issues. As the elevator ground to a halt on the ground floor, Gerald's breath unwound in relief. He told himself, "This is just one more reason to speak up." If no one else at Redwood Vista would address the problem, maybe he could muster the courage to do so at the next HOA meeting. The truth was, Gerald had always preferred to stay out of neighborly squabbles. But ignoring this any longer felt both foolish and dangerous. He imagined a scenario in which someone with an even more fragile condition, maybe a heart patient or a wheelchair user, got trapped. It was a terrifying thought. He stepped off into the lobby, which was still quiet this early in the day. The sun was barely peeking through the glass doors, casting long beams across the scuffed parquet floors. Gerald nodded a warm good morning to Mrs. Abel, who was hunched over a potted fern in the corner. A devoted gardener, she was one of the condo's few volunteers who actually cared about the building's appearance. Gerald admired her dedication, even if the priorities seemed misplaced. On his way out, he spotted the posted notice on the community bulletin board. The black and white flyer read, "HOA meeting, budget finalization," in thick block letters. Beneath the heading, it listed the date and time of the next gathering, with an asterisk that read, "Limited to discussion on lobby renovations." Gerald sighed. Another meeting. Another trivial focus. Lobby renovations can wait, he thought. The elevator can't. After leaving the building, he walked toward his car, a sensible sedan that was nearly as old as his adult daughter. But as the gentle autumn breeze played with the few strands of his thinning hair, he made a quiet pledge to himself. He would speak up. If the board refused to listen, at least he'd know he tried. No one could have anticipated how quickly his concern would turn into a life-or-death matter. Even then, the squeal of the elevator cables was a warning, a herald of what was to come. Gerald had no idea that before the month was out, his own life would hang in the balance, trapped in the very cage he feared might one day prove fatal. The following evening, Gerald mustered the courage to attend the HOA meeting. He entered the stale conference room on the first floor, which had been converted from a long-disused laundry area into what was now the official community center. Its bare walls were sporadically decorated with outdated calendars and an amateur painting of Redwood Vista's facade. A single fluorescent light hummed overhead. Seated at a folding table in front were the 5 board members: Charles Klein, the president with a perpetual scowl; Linda Martinez, the treasurer who always insisted on itemized budgets; Patricia Kelly, the secretary who typed fervently on a battered laptop; and the 2 at-large members, Harriet Green and Walter Dyson, who seemed to exist primarily to fill seats. Their faces bore the weary, half-resigned expressions of people who had seen better days but now had to manage squabbling neighbors on a budget that never stretched far enough. Gerald found a seat near the back. He recognized only a handful of the other residents. Attendance was typically poor. Most folks at Redwood Vista had either given up on hope for major improvements or dreaded the tension that inevitably rose whenever budgets were discussed. To Gerald's surprise, the meeting started with a considerable amount of time spent on the beautification project, a fancy term for replacing the artificial plants in the lobby with real greenery and ordering custom doormats embossed with the Redwood Vista logo. An hour passed, with the conversation ping-ponging between Linda's concerns about cost overruns and Charles's defensive stance that first impressions matter for property values. Meanwhile, Harriet and Walter nodded occasionally, contributing little more than polite murmurs. Patricia diligently recorded everything, her eyes flitting back and forth between her screen and the board members. Gerald grew restless. His knee started aching. The familiar twinge warned him he shouldn't be sitting too long in one position. Finally, when the board asked if there were any questions or comments about the new doormat designs, Gerald raised his hand. Charles blinked, clearly unaccustomed to input from a mostly disengaged audience. "Yes, Gerald, you have the floor," Charles said with a tone that feigned interest. Gerald cleared his throat. "Thank you. I'd like to bring up the elevator situation. It seems to be getting worse. Just this morning, I had to wait nearly 3 minutes for the doors to open, and I've heard reports of it stalling. We have some residents who really rely on that elevator. I'm worried about what might happen if it breaks down completely or, heaven forbid, traps someone in there." A tiny hush fell over the room. Linda exchanged a glance with Charles, who pressed his lips into a thin line. "We're aware of the issues. However, major elevator repairs are beyond our current fiscal capacity. We've already allocated funds for next year's operating costs and a portion for the beautification project. Elevator repairs are projected to cost upwards of $30,000. Money we simply don't have right now." Gerald hesitated, feeling his heart hammer in his chest. "But we're talking about a real safety concern. The elevator is critical, especially for those with mobility issues or medical conditions. If the cost is high, shouldn't we consider cutting back on some less urgent improvements, like new doormats or plants?" Harriet coughed softly, as if the idea of cutting back on aesthetics offended her. Patricia stopped typing momentarily. Charles's scowl deepened. "We've crunched the numbers," Charles said. "We plan to address the elevator in the future, but it's not a pressing emergency. We've had a professional evaluation, and they indicated it's old but not in imminent danger of complete failure." "That's not quite accurate," a voice piped up. It was Dorothy Sanders, a retired teacher who sat in the second row. "I read the last maintenance report. The technician recommended a full overhaul within the next 6 months to avoid escalating mechanical failures. 6 months have passed. We're overdue. Linda shifted uncomfortably. It's always a balancing act, Dorothy. The HOA does not have unlimited resources. We just can't afford it right now. Gerald sensed his blood pressure rising. He'd never been one to speak out, but something in him wouldn't let go. Then maybe we need a special assessment, he suggested quietly. We could collect extra funds from each unit to pay for it. It's not convenient, but it might be necessary. If something dire happens, it'll cost us all more in the long run, and not just financially. Someone could be seriously hurt. At that, Charles's patience snapped. Gerald, I appreciate your concern, but do you have any idea how difficult it is to convince people around here to pay more fees? Half of our residents are on fixed incomes. The board has to consider that. But ignoring safety won't save us in the end, Gerald said, voice trembling. All I ask is that we prioritize properly. A tense silence fell over the room. Harriet stared at her paperwork. Walter scratched the back of his neck, and Patricia resumed typing, possibly capturing the awkward exchange. Charles finally sighed, dismissing Gerald with a wave. Your concerns are noted, Gerald. We'll bring it up in the next budget review. Now, if there are no further comments on the doormats, I'd like to move on. A dull ache pooled in Gerald's stomach as the meeting trudged forward, ignoring the gravity of what he'd just said. He felt a pang of desperation. He glanced at Dorothy, who gave him a sympathetic smile. He also noticed a few others nodding in agreement, but their eyes said they felt as powerless as he did. When the meeting wrapped, Gerald trudged back to his unit, a swirl of frustration and fear coursing through him. The elevator delivered its usual rattling performance, and once more he wondered, what if it decides not to move one day? That night, sleep refused to come easily. Thoughts of catastrophic breakdowns haunted his mind. He pictured an elderly woman with a heart condition or someone stuck without medication, pounding helplessly on the metal walls. He never imagined fate would cast him in that exact role. He never imagined the clock on his own life would tick down in a stale, confined box with no one able to hear his final pleas. A week later, early morning clouds gathered overhead, painting the sky in shades of silver and slate. Gerald stirred in bed, the beep of his glucose monitor rousing him before the alarm. He reached for the device on his nightstand and confirmed his blood sugar was within acceptable limits, though on the lower side. He grabbed a granola bar and chewed it slowly, thoughtful. The HOA's indifference still gnawed at him, but life had a way of moving on, overshadowing big issues with everyday tasks and errands. Around 8 a.m., he ventured into the corridor. He had scheduled a checkup with his doctor for that morning, and as always, he carried his cooler bag with insulin and a few snacks. The corridor was quiet, save for the hum of electricity behind the walls. Familiar with the elevator's quirks, he tapped the call button and listened to the distant grind of gears. The doors slid open, jerking to a stop a few inches too low for the floor. Gerald stepped gingerly over the uneven threshold. The elevator groaned as it descended. He tapped his foot, feeling a flicker of anxiety. It seemed to be taking longer than usual between floors. Suddenly, with a jolt that rattled his bones, the elevator lurched and halted abruptly. His stomach flipped. The overhead light flickered, then died, leaving him in near darkness except for the faint glow from the panel. Gerald's heart pounded. He fumbled for the emergency stop button, but realized the elevator had already decided to stop on its own. He pressed the open door button, nothing. He tried the call button for the front desk, but the speaker emitted only static. Outside, there was no telling which floor he was near. The passing lights behind the elevator's grated window were non-existent. All he heard was the faint hum of electricity, the hiss of elevator cables holding him in midair. Time began to blur. Gerald tried to calm himself. Don't panic. Someone will notice. They'll fix it. He pressed the alarm button repeatedly, hoping it would trigger a buzzer loud enough for maintenance or neighbors to hear. The alarm rang out, but the thick walls seemed to mute the sound. He paused, took a deep breath, and reminded himself that Redwood Vista was full of people who would eventually need the elevator. Someone would discover it wasn't working. His mind drifted to the conversation from the HOA meeting. The uneasy feeling of a prophecy fulfilled crawled up his spine. If they had set aside money for repairs, if they had listened, but regrets wouldn't help him now. He prayed someone on the outside would come to investigate soon. Minutes trickled by, or maybe it was an hour. He couldn't tell. His phone had no signal deep within the building's concrete skeleton. He tried to remain upbeat. He had his insulin if it came to that, though typically he administered it at prescribed intervals. Still, better to have it than not. But what about water? He only had a small bottle left over from the day before. And how long could he stay calm in this suffocating box without air circulation? He pressed the alarm again. The faint ring echoed in the shaft, seeming to bounce back mockingly. Gerald pounded on the walls, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Help! Is anyone there?" The response was silence. He forced himself to sit on the floor, leaning against the corner to minimize the strain on his knees. Mentally, he replayed scenes from the past: his daughter's wedding, his grandson's birth, the day he moved into Redwood Vista with a sense of optimism. The memories offered a small comfort, but gnawing worry set in. What if help wasn't coming soon? He glanced at his glucose monitor, noticing that stress and hunger were nudging his levels downward. An hour, possibly two, dragged on. He felt the dryness in his throat intensify. He tried to ration his sips of water. Occasionally, he heard faint movement in the hallway beyond, or so he thought. Perhaps it was just his mind conjuring noises. "Stay calm," he repeated. He gnawed on half of his granola bar, saving the rest for later. Then his watch beeped. It was time for another blood sugar check. He dug out the device, noticing that his levels had dipped below his comfort zone. "All right, you got this," he muttered, popping a glucose tablet. He still had a few left in the cooler bag. He tried pressing the alarm once more. Still no response. Fatigue rolled over him like a heavy blanket. The stale air stung his nostrils. "Someone has to realize," he murmured between labored breaths. The suffocating quiet pressed in, intensifying his sense of isolation. The overhead panel offered no clue to time. Without windows or a watch that could read signals, minutes felt like hours. Just when his hope began to dim, he heard a muffled voice from somewhere above. "Hello," a distant, echoing call. Gerald bolted upright. "I'm here. I'm stuck," he yelled, banging on the metal doors. "Down here. Please help." He held his breath, waiting for the next sound, a comforting promise of rescue. Instead, the faint voice drifted away, as if responding to someone else's call, or perhaps mishearing him entirely. The building's old bones swallowed the sound. Gerald sank back, heart pounding wildly. At least there was life out there. He prayed that whoever it was would investigate the elevator soon. In that moment, fear turned to anger. They should have fixed it. They should have fixed this months ago. He thought of all the times the HOA waved off concerns. He swore if he got out, he'd do more than just file complaints. He'd rally the entire building. Because now, he understood that negligence was a slow, creeping plague, and sometimes it took a crisis like this to jolt people awake. But as minutes folded into hours, Gerald's physical condition started to slip. Each attempt to cry out drained him, and the darkness, broken only by the dim emergency lights, began to feel like a tomb. In the back of his mind, a new fear blossomed. What if help arrived too late? By mid-afternoon, the corridor on Gerald's floor remained eerily calm. Most of the building's retirees were off attending social clubs, running errands, or visiting family. A few lingered in their units, but none had reason to suspect the elevator was trapping a neighbor between floors. At around 3 p.m., Dorothy Sanders returned from lunch with a friend. She pressed the call button for the elevator, but the panel's light did not respond. After a moment, she tried again. "It must be out of service," she muttered to herself. For a fleeting second, a memory of Gerald's warning flitted through her mind. She felt a shiver of unease. Perhaps it was time to inform management. She shuffled over to the front desk in the lobby, only to find it unstaffed. The building manager, Stephen Hall, was notoriously inconsistent with his hours. Dorothy left a note on a bright pink sticky pad, scrawling, "Elevator not working. Please check ASAP." She returned to the elevator and pressed her ear to the metal doors, listening for any sign of movement. Silence. Up in his prison of steel, Gerald had slipped into a state of restless half-consciousness. He battled waves of dizziness. Even the small sips of water he rationed were nearly gone. Earlier, he tried using his insulin as scheduled, only to realize he risked plummeting blood sugar without enough food to balance it. So he delayed it, uncertain which was more dangerous, high or low levels. Each option felt like a gamble in the dark. His watch battery finally died, leaving him with no sense of time. The once harsh fluorescent flicker over his head had grown comfortingly familiar. Anything was better than the absolute blackness whenever it blinked out. He whispered broken sentences to himself, reciting stories from childhood or the capital cities of states, anything to keep his mind from drifting into despair. Late afternoon sunlight slanted through the lobby's windows when Stephen Hall finally strolled in, a cup of coffee in hand. He spotted the neon pink note on his desk. "Elevator not working," he read aloud. His expression was more annoyed than concerned. He made a quick phone call to the maintenance hotline, leaving a message. But as the day wore on, no one arrived to check. Stephen, preoccupied with a personal errand, grabbed his keys and left again. Meanwhile, Dorothy paced the lobby, occasionally poking her head out to see if a repair truck or even a building maintenance worker would show up. She grew anxious, remembering Gerald's impassioned plea at the meeting. Something felt off. She decided to knock on a few neighbors' doors, seeking help or at least moral support. She reached Mrs. Abel's unit, who was busy tending to her cat. Dorothy explained the elevator situation. "We should check if anyone who left their apartment earlier never came back," she suggested, her voice trembling slightly. Mrs. Abel's eyes widened. "You think someone might be stuck in there?" "It's possible," Dorothy answered, her mind already imagining Gerald's kind face. She knew he often left for doctor's appointments. "I haven't seen Gerald in a while." The two women hurried to his door and knocked. No response. After repeated attempts, Dorothy's anxiety soared. "He was supposed to see his doctor today," she murmured. "What if?" They wasted no time. Dorothy phoned the local fire department to report a potential elevator entrapment, while Mrs. Abel tried to find Stephen Hall or any staff on site. But Redwood Vista's staff was perpetually short-handed, and Stephen was nowhere to be found. By now, Gerald's breathing was shallow. His mind drifted through a fog where time and place blurred. He thought he heard voices echo around him, muffled by metal, like listening through water. His cooler bag, which once seemed a lifeline, now taunted him with the knowledge that nothing in it could fully prevent the creeping dehydration and exhaustion. Then came a distant rumble, footsteps, maybe, or the vibrations of people moving around overhead. "Help!" he croaked, too weak for his voice to carry. The overhead light flickered off again, plunging him into near-total darkness. He felt tears prick at the corners of his eyes. The dryness of his throat made even crying painful. Sometime around dusk, the local fire department arrived. 2 firefighters tried to manually open the elevator doors on the lobby level. When that failed, they made their way to each floor, checking to see where it might be stuck. Dorothy hovered nearby, wringing her hands, her heart pounding. On the 8th floor, they found the elevator partially jammed just below the level of the floor. The doors were crookedly aligned, stubbornly refusing to budge. One firefighter shouted, "If someone's in there, hang on. We're working on getting to you." Dorothy pressed her ear to the metal. "Gerald, Gerald, are you in there?" she cried. Within the claustrophobic box, Gerald heard muffled pounding. Summoning every last ounce of energy, he tried to respond, but managed only a faint rasp. The claustrophobic gloom blurred his vision. His glucose levels had likely skyrocketed or plunged. He could no longer be sure. His limbs tingled with pins and needles. Each breath felt like a struggle against an invisible weight. The firefighters pried at the door edges with specialized tools, but the mechanism inside was jammed tight. They radioed for additional support, possibly a technician with more specific elevator experience. Dorothy paced the hallway, whispering frantic prayers. Some of the other residents gathered, forming a small crowd. Their eyes brimmed with worry as each minute stretched. Finally, after nearly an hour of combined effort, the team managed to create a narrow gap. Dorothy's heart soared with fleeting hope when one of the firefighters said, "I see someone, man down on the floor." They pried until the opening was wide enough for a rescuer to shimmy inside. Silence gripped the hallway. Dorothy closed her eyes, tears slipping down her cheeks. The rescuer inside shouted, "We need a medic fast." Gerald lay still, his face pale, lips dry and cracked. The paramedics rushed forward, but the stifling heat and lack of ventilation had ravaged him. They began CPR and administered emergency care right there in the cramped elevator. Dorothy clenched her hands together, muttering, "Please, please, please." Minutes felt like hours, but the paramedics' grim expressions told the story. They lowered Gerald gently onto a stretcher once the elevator was fully opened, continuing CPR as they hustled him toward the waiting ambulance. Dorothy followed, tears streaming, her voice trembling. "He's going to be all right?" No one answered. The paramedics moved with swift efficiency, hooking Gerald to machines that beeped ominously. The cluster of onlookers parted like a sorrowful tide as the gurney rushed by. An unspoken dread filled the air. The sterile scent of disinfectant hit Dorothy's nostrils the moment she stepped into the hospital lobby. She followed the paramedics, who disappeared behind swinging double doors marked "Emergency Personnel Only." Nurses bustled around, hardly glancing at her. She understood she could go no further and slumped into a plastic waiting room chair, numb with dread. Minutes ticked by, morphing into half an hour, then an hour. Dorothy tapped her foot restlessly. She recognized the paramedics' expressions back at Redwood Vista. There had been precious little hope in their eyes. She prayed for a miracle anyway. Finally, a solemn-faced doctor emerged. "Are you family?" he asked Dorothy. She shook her head, hands clasped on her lap. "I'm a neighbor. He's alone. Please, just tell me." The doctor exhaled softly. "I'm sorry. We did everything we could. Mr. Morrison didn't survive." Dorothy felt the words like a punch to the gut. She slumped against the chair, tears welling in her eyes. She'd feared this, but the finality tore through her. The doctor gently placed a hand on her shoulder, explaining that prolonged confinement without adequate air circulation, coupled with Gerald's medical condition, had led to severe complications. By the time the paramedics reached him, he had slipped too far away for resuscitation to succeed. The news spread through Redwood Vista within hours. Grief mingled with shock. Gerald had always been a friendly, supportive presence. Word of his passing sparked guilt-ridden whisperings about the failing elevator, the HOA's negligence, and the misaligned priorities that had funneled money into cosmetic fixes rather than life-saving repairs. Dorothy became the de facto spokesperson for the outraged residents. She contacted local news stations, recounting the tragic ordeal in front of the camera with trembling honesty. Gerald warned them. "We all did," she said, tears glistening. "We asked for a special assessment. We asked for them to prioritize our safety. They didn't listen, and now we've lost a good man." Outrage ignited among the residents. Harriet Green resigned from the board the next day, claiming she could no longer be part of a group that ignored such grave concerns. Patricia Kelly, shaken by Gerald's death, published the meeting minutes online, revealing how often the elevator repair requests were tabled due to lack of budget. There was in black and white, a record of warnings and pleas, all brushed aside. Pressure mounted on Charles Klein and Linda Martinez, with a large faction of the residents calling for their immediate removal. A candlelight vigil was organized in the courtyard, where people placed pictures of Gerald, flowers, and handwritten notes. One note read, "We are sorry we couldn't save you. We'll never let this happen again." At the vigil, Dorothy mustered the courage to speak. Gerald was kind. He was patient. He believed in doing things the right way, not just the easy way. We owe it to him, and to ourselves, to make this building safe. Her voice choked with emotion. He shouldn't be just another statistic in a newspaper article about negligence. He should be a wake-up call. The next morning, the HOA board faced a horde of angry residents demanding accountability. The local news cameras rolled. Linda, visibly distressed, admitted that the board had prioritized aesthetic projects to keep property values up. "We never imagined something so tragic could happen," she lamented. But the crowd's fury was unyielding. Some residents talked of filing a wrongful death lawsuit. Others asked for immediate resignations. Amid the chaos, an older woman with a cane spoke up. She explained how she had once been trapped in that same elevator for half an hour weeks prior, but had been rescued in time. "I was one of the lucky ones," she said, her eyes glistening. "We were warned. Gerald was the price we paid for ignoring it." When the formal HOA hearing convened a week later, Redwood Vista's rec room was packed to the brim. Many residents supported a motion to recall the board. The meeting began with an empty seat draped in black cloth at the front, symbolizing Gerald's absence. Pictures from the candlelight vigil were pinned to a corkboard. Shots of flickering candles, flowers, and the sorrowful faces of neighbors in mourning. Charles Klein, in a suit that hung loosely on his gaunt frame, tried to keep the proceedings in order, but he had lost nearly all authority. One by one, residents stood to voice not just condemnation, but also solutions. A special fund for elevator repair. A new accountability process for HOA decisions. A revision of Redwood Vista's bylaws to ensure safety concerns topped the agenda. Dorothy rose last. "None of us can bring Gerald back," she said, voice quavering. "But we can honor him by making sure no one else ever has to lose a life because of our negligence. We are a community. Let's act like one." Unanimous support poured in for the recall of the old board. Charles Klein and Linda Martinez were removed, effective immediately. A temporary management team was installed, with Dorothy at the helm of the safety committee. That very night, calls were made to elevator repair companies. Within days, repairs began in earnest. The new team vowed they would raise whatever money was needed to bring the building's critical infrastructure up to code. In the weeks that followed, Redwood Vista felt like a changed place. Strangers stopped in the halls to greet each other. Offers of help were exchanged between neighbors, and the memory of Gerald Morrison hung in the air like a silent reminder of how quickly life could slip away when responsibility was cast aside. At a memorial service held in the building's modest courtyard, people shared stories about Gerald's quiet generosity, helping a neighbor with groceries, offering a friendly ear to those down on their luck, kindly reminding the board about the elevator. The sense of communal guilt melded with a vow for collective improvement. Redwood Vista would no longer be a place where pleas fell on deaf ears. Shortly after the memorial, Dorothy received a call from Gerald's daughter, who lived out of state. She thanked Dorothy for being there for her father in his final moments, even if at a distance. "He always told me he loved Redwood Vista because of the community," the daughter said between sobs. "Please, don't let this happen again. Help him fix things." Dorothy promised she would. And through her tears, she believed that maybe, in the end, Gerald's final warning would save countless other lives, transforming Redwood Vista into the safe haven it was always meant to be, instead of the place where one man's tragic death marked a turning point the community had desperately needed. The end.